Thank you guys for your presence this weekend, and the presence of 1,500 social justice advocates and leaders really fills me with a sense of hope, even at a time when some of the realities we're seeing on the ground are really grim. So thanks for being here. As someone introduced me, Danny, I think it was, introduced me earlier, and I'm Shaina Aber. I'm the policy director at the Jesuit Conference of the United States and Canada. Over the last 5 years, the Jesuits of Canada and the United States and our partners in the region have tracked the increase in forced displacement and targeted violence perpetrated by gangs, organized crime, and state authorities in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. The migration trends from the region have changed. Entire families, younger children, and more women and girls are moving beyond the borders of the Northern Triangle of Central America, fleeing violence and impunity that has reached record levels, where children, business owners, and vulnerable women and girls are caught in the crossfire between brutal police and even more brutal gangs. Poor communities in urban centers live in the state of constant pressure and duress from gangs that extort families, impose curfews, and forcibly recruit and prostitute in children. Unfortunately, the victims of these communities cannot appeal to the police for help because they're as afraid of the police as they are of the gangs. Last month, for example, our partners in Honduras documented a door-to-door raid by police in San Pedro Sula that ended in the torture and murder of a school-aged boy who, by all accounts, had no involvement in any gang activity. And this year in May, the government of El Salvador deployed army battalions onto the street to do battle with gangs, further evidence of a disheartening trend of reliance on extrajudicial executions rather than strengthening judicial systems, breaking the cycles of violence, addressing the crippling inequality, lack of opportunity, and corruption that have made the Northern Triangle the most violent region on Earth. The US government security assistance is providing millions of dollars in support to these countries, but we must tell our leaders, we will not stand by complicit in the murder of children in San Pedro Sula, Honduras, Guatemala City, or San Salvador. Many of you know that our government has responded to the crisis in the Northern Triangle, and particularly to the flow of refugees fleeing to find safety in ways that do not honor our commitment to protecting the lives of people at risk of violence and torture. 83 men and women from the Northern Triangle of Central America were deported to their deaths over the past year from the United States. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of people from El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala have been intercepted in Mexico and returned without the opportunity to claim refugee status. Rather than condemning Mexico's failure to provide protection to refugees, these efforts have been cheered and encouraged by the US authorities, including our president and the Secretary of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson. This behavior is not in line with our values, nor with our international commitment to protect refugees. The Jesuits of Central America and their lay colleagues see the brutal reality of the Northern Triangle daily. Our friend, Father Melo Moreno, who spoke at the teach-in last year, has lost colleagues, friends, and loved ones to the violence. His staff live daily under death threats and police harassment. One colleague is currently trying to protect her young daughter from a gang that has threatened to kill her if she doesn't become a gang leader's girlfriend. The states in the region fail to protect and often target poor and vulnerable people struggling to survive in neighborhoods controlled and besieged by organized crime. No one is effectively addressing the society-wide trauma that is the fallout from years of war and terror. Meanwhile, a class of kleptocrats and unethical multinational companies are profiting from the chaos and the lack of accountability, funneling millions of resources that could go to the needs of people at risk into their own pockets. The collapse of civil society is evident in besieged schools, hollowed out neighborhoods, and tortured, often dismembered bodies of children and women displayed in streets, marketplaces, and in ditches. Tomorrow, tell your members of Congress and senators to reject fallacious arguments that seek to sidestep our country's obligation to protect refugees. This crisis was not created by the Obama administration's program to protect dreamers from deportation, nor did the migration trend begin with a rumor spread by smugglers alluding to the US asylum system. Remember that the number of people from the Northern Triangle seeking asylum in neighboring countries of Mexico, Panama, Nicaragua, Belize, Costa Rica is now 13 times the number of people who solicited asylum from the Northern Triangle in 2008. The crisis was not created by US immigration policy. People are leaving their countries due to desperation, not because the US has a working asylum system. Tomorrow, we are asking our members of Congress to invest in the right of Central Americans to remain at home. The US should work with Central American societies, civil society organizations to hold their governments accountable. Rampant corruption in the region contributes to inequality and poverty that make communities less resilient in the face of violence. Honduran, Guatemalan, and Salvadoran families have the right to live in safe and sustainable communities. But doubling down on militarization of Central American societies does not solve the root causes of violence in the region. Rather, it exacerbates the problem. Second, be firm in the fact that the US must not encourage or finance programs that fuel violence in Central America or degrade the ability of people fleeing violence to access safety in other countries. Congress should condition all security sector funding to Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador on respect for human rights. Likewise, tell your members of Congress to end programs that seek to militarize the borders of Central America and Mexico, cutting off access to asylum for people fleeing violence. These programs endanger the lives of people seeking safety and run counter to our country's obligations under international law. This summer, our world was stunned by the picture of a little Syrian boy, Alan Kurdi, washing ashore on a beach in Turkey. The US expressed concern and even outrage about European countries turning their back on desperate refugees. We are similarly turning our back on Central American refugees and facilitating and encouraging Mexico's flagrant flouting of international law. Finally, for those Salvadorans, Guatemalans, and Hondurans who do arrive in the United States, we must ensure that they have a full and fair process for accessing refugee status and other protections. Tell your members of Congress that the US must live up to the values of fairness and justice. We must ensure that children and families seeking safety within our borders have the ability to tell their stories and have their cases heard. We will not water down protections meant to ensure that traumatized and terrorized victims of persecution and torture or trafficking have the ability to make their case for humanitarian relief in the United States. Convey to your members of Congress the same message carried to them by Pope Francis this September when he said, "We must not be taken aback by their numbers, but rather view them as persons, seeing their faces, listening to their stories, trying to respond as best we can to their situation. We must respond in a way that is always humane, just, and fraternal. We need to avoid a common temptation nowadays to discard whatever seems troublesome." Thanks for your advocacy. I look forward to seeing you on the Hill tomorrow.